To have you join us today. My name is Amy Willis, and I am the director of the Library of Economics and Liberty. It's my very great pleasure to have our regular guest, Arnold Kling, and special guest, John Cochrane, here with us today to talk about the book Arnold most recently reviewed for EconLib by Alan Blinder. So without further ado, I shall turn it over to them shortly. Guests, so that you know, we will open the conversation to question and answer after Arnold and John have finished their discussion. You may do one of two things. You may simply raise your hand and I will keep a queue and enter people into the room to ask their questions as time permits. You are also free to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to submit questions if you'd rather submit questions anonymously or if that's your preferred way to get a question across. So again, welcome. And without further ado, Arnold, I turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Amy. And thanks to John Cochrane for joining us. In case you don't know, John is a very distinguished macroeconomist, a very original thinker who's published a lot of important work in macro and finance. And he's also known to the general public, or to such as if you would call it, for having the Grumpy Economist weblog, among other things. So we're discussing this book by Alan Blinder, or we're using it as a jumping off point, called A Monetary and Fiscal History of the United States, 1961 to 2021. And the thing is, it right smack in the middle of that period, starting in 1968 and then continuing for probably 3 or 4 decades, was something we call the macro wars, where macroeconomics was really shaken up. But here's what, Blinder only puts about half a chapter into actually discussing these. And then he says, in conclusion, at that end of the half chapter, but in retrospect, it seems a waste of intellectual resources that academic economists expended so much pen and ink arguing over whether all markets, including the aggregate labor market, cleared virtually instantly. But that's what they did. So he kind of blows this off, and I'm going to ask John for his comments on it, but I'm going to have to take about 5 minutes to kind of set this up. So once upon a time, there was something called the Phillips curve, a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. So we thought that if unemployment was low, inflation would be high, and vice versa. And in describing this trade-off and publicizing it, Paul Samuelson and Robert Solow wrote a paper saying that it gives policymakers a menu of options to choose from. So they, for example, if you wanted to get inflation down to 2%, you might have to tolerate unemployment of 5.5%. If you're willing to let inflation go up to 3.5%, you might get unemployment down to 4%. So anyway, starting around 1969, for a few years, we started to see combinations that were off the menu and in a bad direction. So things like 6% unemployment and 5% inflation. So both numbers on the high side. And Robert Gordon, the keeper of the Phillips curve, said that you could explain this by adding past inflation as an explanatory variable. So if past inflation was high, that would push up this inflation. And so if he was asked, what's this past inflation doing as an explanatory variable, he would said, that's expectations of future inflation. So he called it the expectations augmented Phillips curve. And Blinder makes a lot of use of that. In fact, he cites Gordon almost more than any other economist in the book. The other thing that happened as the 70s proceeded is that we had even worse outcomes, higher inflation and higher unemployment, and that was blamed on things like the Arab oil embargo or the Iran-Iraq war, which cut off oil supplies. And so thus was born the concept of a supply shock. So a supply shock was added to the expectations augmented Phillips curve. Meanwhile, the very kind of foundation of macroeconomics was being challenged, first by Milton Friedman and then by Robert Lucas. So Friedman, at the end of 1967, he gives a presidential address to the American Economic Association. And he says, wait a minute, in microeconomics, we have adjustment mechanisms that cause surpluses and shortages to dissipate. And so if you think about that in terms of the labor market, there should be some natural rate of unemployment, and the natural adjustment mechanism should take the economy toward that. And so it's not a menu choice for policymakers. If policymakers try to push unemployment one way or another relative to the natural rate, that's just going to cause problems. They're not actually going to succeed. The market is going to fight back and get back to the equilibrium. And then Lucas's issue, conflict between microeconomics and macroeconomics, concerned these expectations, that if you use previous periods inflation to project current or next year's inflation, you're going to be systematically wrong. And Lucas says, hey, in microeconomics, we don't assume that individuals are systematically wrong in the way they approach things. And as a matter of fact, if you don't assume that they're systematically wrong, you assume they're not systematically wrong, you get completely different answers when you ask questions about interpreting the economy or making policy in the economy. So you had those two challenges. And I think for the next few decades, everybody who wrote on macroeconomics had to say something to deal with this apparent conflict between micro and macro. So the term was micro foundations of macro. And incidentally, the term micro foundations doesn't appear in Blinder's book, but I think if you tried to publish a paper in a major journal in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, whatever, and you didn't do something about micro foundations, that was like walking into a church without your shirt on. It was just, you'd be embarrassed. So anyway, with that, I hope that people have caught on to that background. John, what do you think was the outcome of the macro wars?
The outcome, and I hope we'll get back to the book and what it says about things. Right now, there is no macro war anymore. Everybody under 60 who actually does serious quantitative economics operates in pretty much a common framework. And the common framework is very much unlike the framework that Blinder talks about in his book. It is, in fact, the framework he spends a lot of time being snarky about. But the way we think about the economy combines, it has people in it and businesses and micro foundations, if you like, who think about things over time. It has the common ingredients. Now, the common ingredients include prices are a little bit sticky. So the buzzwords are, it includes new Keynesian ingredients, as well as supply shocks, real business cycle ingredients. And you work by the standard rules of economics. And that's how we think about recessions, inflation, growth, labor supply, and so forth. That is the result of, there were wars, but the wars came to a conclusion. And I think right now, economists are using the best we can within our technical abilities of all of those things. That is not, Blinder is right to say that that view, that methodological approach, which is 100% in all the academic journals, 100% in all the research papers of Federal Reserve staff economists and so forth, and everybody under 60, is not commonly used in the high echelons of the Federal Reserve, where sort of back of the envelope Cheshire cat memory of simple-minded ISLM still rules. So he's right in his snarky comments about that. But it's not so obvious that this is a good idea to ignore everything done by a bunch of smart people in macroeconomics since 1972 and rely on an extensively patched up, every failure we add a new patch version of something we learned in graduate school in 1965. So you get I am revealing my grumpiness, and I must say I really wanted to like this book. We need history. Arnold, I can tell you and I are of a certain age, and we remember the 1970s, and we look out the window and we say, oh, here we go, repeating history, this time is farce. And the lessons and history of the 1970s are with us. But if you're of our age, remember when we went to graduate school and all the old fogies were talking about the Great Depression with misty eyes. And what's that about? Well, that's where most people are. We have forgotten the history of the 1970s and 1980s. And I think a book that did the policy history of the 1970s and 1980s, as Blinder says he's going to do, history of policy, not doctrine, is a quote, but it's exactly the opposite. It is a snark-filled rehash of the macro wars, which is too bad.
So shall we turn to today? Sort of what I think it's a very, well, I would say the Chinese curse, maybe live in interesting times. These are interesting times. And what I worry about is that any statement I would make about today's economy could be used against me, that it's unlikely that I'm going to get it right. Maybe in the early 2000s, talking about the economy was easy. Well, we're in the Great Moderation. It's going to continue ad infinitum. That seemed like a reasonable forecast. But now, is inflation going to stop soon? Is it going to keep going? How do you even go about, what tools would you use to try to answer these questions right now?
Basic economics, and especially when you're not sure, get more basic about it. I think, so I will acknowledge, even though I have a view, that there's a great variation in opinion about where we are and where we're going. I think, however, it's always important to start with the most important stuff, which is the microeconomics. And what the sudden emergence of inflation tells us is that a whole bunch of ideas from the 2010s, commonly accepted, except probably not by you and me. We were out there with our signs saying the world's about to end the whole time. But that those ideas are wrong. And the idea is that we are in secular stagnation, that the economy has permanent lack of demand and hysteresis. And all we need is to borrow or print more money and hand it out, and all will be well. In fact, the answer to every problem is to borrow more money and hand it out, and all will be well. This isn't just the modern monetarists. This is consensus, Blinder circles opinion. Don't worry about
Olivier
that.
Blanchard,
Olivier Blanchard.
And he's like the dean of macro.
Interest rates are so, and Janet Yellen said this in her Senate confirmation here, don't worry about debt and deficits. Interest rates are so low, we can afford it. Sort of like the couple buying the starter home on an affordable rate mortgage, adjustable rate mortgage in 2007. Don't worry about the interest cost, debt's gonna go away. All that just hit a brick wall of reality. And I think this is the number one lesson people don't think about right now. We just hit the supply constraint of the economy. Turns out there wasn't endless slack sitting in there. Turns out we were right on the edge of the cliff all along. All it took was handing $5 trillion out to everybody in the form of checks, and bingo, we get inflation worth the supply. Now we're back to now Liberty Fund economics. We need growth. You need supply side growth. And the idea that you just need to throw money at every problem and that government debt, don't worry about it, that just blew up. And I don't think so. That's the number one point of the current situation that I don't think is commonly recognized. We'll get to inflation and where it's going in a minute, but really that we are at the supply limit and need pro-growth policies is the number one lesson of the emergence of inflation. Now, do you want to go back and ask your question again? Maybe this time I'll answer it.
Well, okay, let me just ask a slightly different variation. The UK, are they a canary in the coal mine? Are they the first people to sort of run up against a borrowing constraint?
I'm seeing now they are still borrowing at sharply negative real interest rates. So, the idea that a tiny little twiddle of the tax code is causing a bond market vigilante in the US, Reagan lowered taxes from 70 to 28%. Liz Truss talked about not raising the high tax rate from 40 to 45%, which cost £2 billion pounds without any behavioral responses. That this causes the bond market vigilantes? No.
But
that cliff is out there. But
I agree with that. But she's retreated on that, and the bond market is still saying no. So what does that tell us?
Bond market saying no matter what. I've been carrying this "the world is ending" sign for so long that I'm reluctant to. So I don't know if this is the canary in the coal mine, but it is certainly a fact that a advanced country debt crisis is a possibility, and that it can and will happen sooner or later if we don't fix the fiscal situation in our country. It's like a bank run. It's very unpredictable exactly when it's going to happen. Basically, we have these huge debts and no plan to pay them back. And if interest rates go up, then the interest costs on the debt explode, and then we're in real trouble. And so that it may be the beginning of that, but I don't think so yet. But I'll be late to calling the actual end of the world because I've been worried about this for so long.
Yeah, well, the sense in which it's like a bank run is that there's an equilibrium where everyone says US is fine, it can pay off all its debts, so we'll charge a nice low risk-free interest rate. And then there's another equilibrium where everyone says, not sure that they're going to pay off their debts, so I'm going to add a risk premium. And then that ends up like a bank run. So that actually was the third question I was going to talk to you about.
But I think that bank run is sparked by a somewhat larger event than, let's talk about her 60 billion pounds worth of stupid energy subsidies. That's a great way to start the libertarian revolution, is to hand $60 billion pounds worth of energy subsidies out. I think that, the tragedy of her is the political messaging of, in fact, she was right on what the UK needs, but the political messaging was awful. But I think you need something bigger than $2 billion worth of hated, failure to raise taxes on the rich. I think the next crisis is the likely possibility. When Xi Jinping invades Taiwan and all Pacific trade shuts down, and the U.S. needs to borrow another $10 trillion to stimulate bailout and actually build an army, then we might run into those fiscal limits.
There do seem like a lot of potential triggers for a crisis. A couple of weekends ago, Credit Suisse was, in Matt Levine's term, a negative meme stock. And I was expecting the outcome to that to be a bailout right there. But so far,
we're in a crisis of failure of all our basic institutions. So everybody can see the FDA and the CDC falling apart. I hate to tell you, bank regulation is in the same way. The UK, the pension funds they were basically bailed out by the Bank of England. And this is just plain vanilla. It's a problem set for your first week of Banking 101. How do you stop pension funds from borrowing against their assets and taking on a lot of leverage and then having a margin call? Yet the entire supervisory regulatory apparatus that now in the UK is off on stress testing for climate risk failed to get this one. So I suspect the interest rate rise may expose similar failures of this entire regulatory regime to do its absolutely most basic jobs. And then you get more bailouts. And where does that come from? Eventually, bondholders who say, we're done.
Yeah. Okay, so can you give me a scenario in which we come out of this fine?
Nothing bad happens. Our government, the U.S. is fiscal. So underlying, we got this fiscal problem, and which underlying is a slow growth problem. And this is a this is a shoot yourself in the foot. And the only thing worse than the U.S. is everywhere else in the world. Europe is simply not growing. The UK is not growing. Pro-growth policies are fairly straightforward. So you just have to get out of the way and stop trying to lead the parade. So, waking up to a sane energy policy, which Europe seems to be slowly doing. The U.S. seems to be a little bit.
Well, except for the subsidy part.
Well, actually, the Germans have a clever subsidy scheme, which I hope they'll put in if they're going to do it. The temptation to price controls and rationing will be a disaster. But subsidizing you up to like 80% of what you bought last year, but then on the margin, you have to pay the price. That's actually fairly clever. And I hope they do something like that, because silencing the price system is the first temptation. And that's, we seem to have a once in a century crisis every decade. And now we're having our second. We just had COVID, which was $5 trillion in the US. And we're Europe's heading into the second crisis, which is a recession, massive energy price hikes, and a war going on. And, they're going to try to meet this with a river of borrowed money too.
How does
you wanted a healthy thing, back to pro-growth policies. That pays off the debt. Simple, repeat the 1986 tax reform, fix the stupid healthcare mess, which is not that hard. The standard libertarian program would get us growing like crazy and get us out of our problems quickly. But you need a better than Liz Truss's person to advance the cause.
So how do the problems in Europe affect the U.S.? Is it in some ways, I think, we benefit from every international financial crisis, even when we started, because, people just come to us as a safe haven. Is that good for us, bad for us?
That used to be true. In March 2020, it was no longer true. So it used to, in the great financial crisis, yes, the U.S. chose to borrow an enormous amount of money. Unfortunately, everybody was trying desperately to sell every other asset and buy U.S. Treasury bills, both domestic and foreign. March 2020, the Treasury went to sell Treasury bills, and all of a sudden, all the foreigners were selling Treasury bills. Remember, those are reserves with a reserve currency. Well, sometimes you want to get rid of your risky assets and hold more reserves. Sometimes you want to sell your reserves and buy stuff with it. And so the Fed stepped in and bought 70% of the new issues of treasuries throughout the pandemic because there weren't private markets. And you kind of alluded to some of the same business going on in the UK. So I would not trust that if we have a calamity in Europe, Italy goes bankrupt, or there's a real estate calamity in China that could happen. Maybe this is the time, rather than trying to change risky assets into U.S. government debt, people say, oh, good, I'm going to sell my U.S. government debt because I got to, keep my consumption going. Not obvious where it's going to stick that way.
So you alluded to bank runs earlier. We saw the recent Nobel Prize award for coming up with ideas on bank runs. And what's your reaction to that one?
I'll summarize quickly a recent Grumpy Economist blog post, which I recommend people if they want to hear more. So there was a fine Nobel Prize. Both Diamond and Dybvig wrote a model of bank runs. They didn't say to the average reader, they kind of put math around what seemed obvious. If we're worried about the bank, I run down there to get my money out before you get your money out. And even a healthy bank can fail. Jimmy Stewart explained it beautifully. Your money is in his house and your money is in his house. You can't all have it back at once. But by writing down a model, this is what economists do. You see actually all the ingredients that it takes, and you see how delicate a bank run really is to get going. And that they wrote a model where they said, oh, deposit insurance can solve this problem, which is what we tried in the 1930s. But it also, by writing a model, you can see all the 100 other ways to solve the problem, which is, I think, my favorite is we should have another idea from the 1930s, which is equity finance banking and narrow deposits that are all 100% backed. Well, that comes out of Diamond and Dybvig's analysis too. So All Nobels are most Nobels are methodological, not that you solved the problem, but you wrote down a model that 1,000 people got to use to write their PhD theses and get tenure. But in doing so, they learned a lot of stuff too. So that was just fine. Similarly, Bernanke, he did not get the Nobel Prize for being Fed chair. He got the Nobel Prize for a beautiful article in 1980, 2 or 3, I think it was, where he said, what happened in the Great Depression? The banks failed, lots of bank failures. Why did that make the economy worse off? Milton Friedman said, because as a result, people didn't have enough money to buy things. That doesn't really make a lot of sense. What Bernanke pointed out is the banks that failed in the 1930s, the people who knew how to make loans were out of a job. So you couldn't get credit and you couldn't keep the economy going. Now, that was true in the 1930s. Because you couldn't have branch banking. Citi and JP Morgan couldn't come in, buy up the assets and keep the bank going. And 100 others. That doesn't mean we always have to bail out all banks. And that also doesn't address at all the problem that if we do bail out banks, then they have an incentive to take way too much risk. So again, it was a beautiful analysis of what went wrong in the 1930s, but don't take that lesson to be always and everywhere. You got to make sure every individual bank never goes bankrupt. It highlights all the many other ways in which you can solve the problem.
I think I complain even harder about applying that paper to the 2008 situation, because you're talking about, losing institutional capital, relationships between a small bank and the community, and that just wasn't what our banking system looked like. It's not
the part that failed.
Yeah,
the relationship banking, I know the butcher is good for it and the baker's a schmooze and will waste all the money. That's not Lehman Brothers derivatives book.
It's not people.
And even Lehman Brothers derivatives book, the Lehman Brothers trading operation was up and running the next day under new ownership. Bankruptcy is not a crater, it's reorganization. There are sources of capital now. There are other, so yes, agreed.
So anyway, I still think, this Nobel does not close the books on the macroeconomics of the great financial crisis, as far as I'm concerned. It's not like,
absolutely no.
Yeah.
And I will fault the committee a little bit, because they said that the authors showed that deposit insurance and bailouts were, quote, optimal. That is not in the papers. That's not what they showed. Nobel Prizes, understand, are for founding literatures, not for closing. If you wrote the grand paper that actually solved banking crises, you'd never get a Nobel Prize because nobody could cite you. What they did is they opened some questions, gave historical tools, and then thousands of other people followed them. And Nobel Prizes are for that sort of influence and for getting something going, not for closing it.
Okay, so before we get to questions, which we'll do in a couple minutes, so what did you like most about Blinder's book, and what made you most grumpy?
It almost all made me grumpy, and that will be a long answer. I guess that when he did what he said he was going to do and talked about policy and politics, I found it quite useful. The chapter on Carter, for example, he had some nice things to say about Carter, and Carter did some nice things. Carter appointed Paul Volcker, even though it knew it would cost him the election. Carter got deregulation going, airlines and trucks. So that was a good chapter because it hewed to what he said. The rest really got the grumpy economist going. Mostly the smart, snarky rehash about how ISLM is wonderful. ISLM, the kind of Keynesian economics he's talking about, is completely failed. And his book shows it. Time after time, it completely falls apart. And Blinder says, oh, no, but we added a patch and a duct tape and put it together. And that shows you how it's all fine. They missed the inflation of the 1960s. The Phillips curve shifted. They missed the stagflation of the 1970s. Oh, we'll add supply shocks. Oh, you're in love with supply shocks? Then what's all the snark about real business cycle models, which are all about supply shocks? In 1980, they said, we can't possibly stop this inflation. The Phillips curve, it's going to take a decade for the Phillips curve to go down, raise the inflation target. By the way, exactly what people are saying now. It's all supply shocks. It's not our fault. Don't worry. Oh, we need price controls, which the Keynesians were also saying until they decided that was terrible too. We can't possibly, the recent Brookings paper, they just did this. We have to raise the inflation target. It'll cost too much to get rid of inflation. They were wrong with that. In 2008, they said, here comes the great deflation spiral. We have to do something wild. No, they were wrong about that. Over and over again, this thing is wrong, wrong, wrong. It's, if you let me go on, it's completely wrong as a matter of theory. There's about 7 Nobel Prizes pointing out how this thing is logically inconsistent. Nobody under the age of 60 even begins to think this way. You can't publish a paper this way. In fact, I remember being a grad student and somebody came along and gave a talk about, oh, the young whippersnappers and all their math that doesn't real world and, intuition. And I remembered to tell myself, if I ever start saying that, I should retire. Well, that's exactly what he's doing. So it is not, it's kind of a snarky, everything, what I learned in graduate school in 1965, patched up again and again and again to match every single one of its failures, even though it embodies every single fallacy you could possibly ask for in economics in one place. That's the eternal verity, even though nothing everybody is now actually doing in economics, even though it makes no intellectual sense, is a wonderful thing. So I just found that sort of snarky. There's a lot of political snark in there too. I just found that it makes me grumpy.
Okay, so nothing wrong with macroeconomics other than it violates everything that we, it contains every logical fallacy.
No, nothing wrong with Keynesian macroeconomics. And let me be clear about that. Keynesian macroeconomics, what do you know about economics? The number one lesson about economics is incentives matter. It's not so much about giving who gets what money, but the incentives on the margin and prices. Nope, Keynesian macro, we don't even think about incentives. We just throw money around. The Bastiat fallacy, broken windows are good for you because you get more aggregate demand to fix them. Budget constraints don't matter. We just pick ourselves up by our food service. It has no people in it. People in the Keynesian model is just consumption depends on income, not people do stuff. We ignore budget constraints that if you consume more, you have to save less. It's every year at a time. So the core, what is modern macroeconomics really? It's intertemporal and incentives. People think about today versus tomorrow. That's what all those Nobel Prizes for. Sorry, so intellectually incoherent, failed time after time, patched up ex post. And this is, let me have one more thing, and then I'll shut up because I'm really on a roll about this. He really savages Lucas and Sargent, who wrote this paper after Keynesian macroeconomics. Go back and read after Keynesian macroeconomics. It is a beautiful eulogy for Keynesian economics of the 1970s. Keynesian economics in the 1970s was respectable. It had equations. The equations had numbers in them. The numbers were fit by data. It made quantitative predictions. If you could fit the data and say, if we do X to monetary, if we do X to fiscal policy, here's how it's going to. It was a scientific enterprise. What is left of Keynesian economics? It's the back of the envelope. Look at the stimulus in 2008. Deficit times 1.5 is stimulus. That's it. The whole beautiful quantitative enterprise that Lucas and Sargent so rightly eulogized, but said, sorry, it's beautiful, but it was wrong. That's gone. All that's left is this little Cheshire cat, the back of the envelope. And incidentally, Blinder himself, I went to the end of the book. He says, why do we have inflation now? We have inflation because of supply shocks. The dog ate my homework. It wasn't my fault. Ignore the fact that we printed up $5 trillion and gave it to people. Okay, Larry Summers himself takes that same back of the envelope and says, some deficit, 5 trillion times 1.5, you're going to get inflation. It's not that hard. So it's political and self-serving as well as incoherent. And I'm just disappointed because I like Blinder. Blinder is a knowledgeable, sensible, usually middle of the road person. He's one of the liberals I respect because he's usually wrong, but he expresses it usually in a coherent way. And this just, I think it's the snark that really got me, as well as the defense of completely of ideas nobody under 60 takes at all seriously.
Okay. So why don't we turn this over to questions. Amy, if you want to either read some questions or have somebody ask some.
I do. Thank you, Arnold. Already, this is one of the most enlightening and entertaining conversations I've had on macro in a long time. So we have a lot of questions, and I'm ready to take hands from people. Let's see, Matthew, you had a couple of questions. I'm going to put the first one about a literature review in the chat because I think that might be better. And John, if I can help you find the link, please let me know. But Matthew, I've let you in, and if you want to go ahead with your second question, that would be great.
Thanks very much. And hello, Arnold. It's Matt Gelfand.
Yeah, hi.
My question is about the debt overhang that our country and many other advanced economies have. And you mentioned earlier that this would be a solvable problem if we pursued pro-growth policies, if we reform the healthcare system, which I agree is, from an economist's perspective, a relatively easy thing to do. And if we reformed taxes, the last thing you mentioned is if we pay off the debt. And that's the question is, if we pursue the other three policies that I itemized, would it be enough for us to just grow out of the debt problem, where do we need to pay the debt off faster than a reformed economy could grow?
I'll take that one. I think the growth would do it because bond markets are very patient if they know you're good for it in the long run. So, Queen Victoria paid off 160% of GDP or so in post-Napoleonic War debt over 60 years just by growing out of it. And if you have a economy, a stable policy regime dedicated to long-run growth, people know this is going to last decades. So you don't really, in a sense, you don't really grow out of it. So when the economy, why is growth the only answer? If you raise taxes, that's like going up a sand dune, because every time you raise marginal tax rates, you kill the economy. So the total revenue, it may not be negative, but it doesn't go up as much as the revenue. And whereas if you let the economy grow, then tax rate times income goes up, and you don't have to do anything to tax rates. You start hauling in money, and if the economy grows faster, then the government doesn't need to spend as much. So it's not just growth outpacing the interest rate. It's also growth lowers the amount of budget. It helps the budget directly. So really, growth is the magic answer. And it would give, growth is so long run that then people have confidence that we're on a good track to pay it off.
Thank you. Kevin, I've added you into the group. Kevin and now I are concerned about his grandma. So he has a question coming up.
Yeah, thank you. John, so I remember listening when I was younger to the old Milton Friedman talks. He would say inflation is everywhere and always a monetary phenomenon. If you print money, you get inflation. That was super simple when I'm sitting at Thanksgiving talking to my grandma to explain to her. How do I do the same for fiscal theory of the price level? When my grandma says, what causes inflation, how do I make it simple enough that she can understand what's going on there?
Well, let me take one shot at that before you do.
Please,
Simple
you go.
thing. You write, okay, so they write your grandma and everyone else a check, and they don't create any more output. What can possibly happen? If there's no more goods and the government's writing these checks, anyway. So John, you can maybe give your a little bit more sophisticated answer than that, but hopefully still for the grandma.
Well, I think Friedman would say, yes, that's money. You've created money there because checking accounts are money. Fiscal theory and monetary theory agree on this one. If we print money and hand it out, that's actually not monetary policy. The Fed is not allowed to print money and hand it out. The Treasury has to hand out money. It records as a transfer payment and records as a deficit when you do that. Money is just another form of government debt to a fiscal theorist. So yeah, print money, hand it out. That's higher debt, no plan to pay it off. Of course, it makes inflation. The key question is to ask grandma is, okay, grandma, they drop $1,000 from the helicopter and you get that. But at the same time, they take away $1,000 of your treasury bills. So your total wealth doesn't change at all. Are now you going to run out and spend? Now that's the key question. The key question is not whether deficit financed money printing causes inflation. Yes, duh. It's whether an exchange of money for bonds causes inflation. If I take your 20s and give you 2 5s and a 10, are you going to out and spend? Well, taking your treasury bills and giving you reserves is like taking your 20s and giving you 2 5s and a 10.
Oh,
So
them's
it's not
fighting
so
words.
all that inflation.
Them's fighting words for Scott Sumner. If we
Yeah, I know.
had him on.
Unfortunately, Scott isn't here. We're talking to Grandma.
We'll let Scott know what your advice for grandma is. PJ, I've let you and you have a question and you are up next. Thank you. Sorry, PJ, can you go ahead and there you go.
Sorry about that. You'd think I'd know how to use this by now. So for going back to your brief discussion on whether the crisis will hit US bond markets, for a run on US sovereign debt to occur, it seems like investors would have to dump treasuries in exchange for something else. So what would that something else be, keeping in mind that, as you say, the US is the worst except for everything else in the world?
The tallest pygmy.
Well, let's say, well, for real assets, first of all. So, when you spy inflation coming, or when you spy a default coming, what you first do is you dump treasuries and you buy stocks, bonds, real estate, gold, Krugerrands, Bitcoin, other stuff like that. You drive those prices up, and then you say, well, let's start buying goods and services. So that's where it goes. But so there's first private assets, and then durable goods, and then everything.
Thanks. John Elkhorn, you have a question next, please.
You have to unmute. There you go.
Yes. My question is about Professor Cochrane's recipe of standard pro-growth policies. And the question is, isn't part of the problem—
The ones that Grandma said are the, Grandma economics is what I call it. Come on, stop goofing off with stimulus. Let's, get the incentive. Sorry, John, I interrupted.
Isn't part of the problem the fact that few economists now endorse standard pro-growth policies of the sort that you outlined? And isn't it the fact that most economists have come to embrace and endorse big government, whether it's debt and deficit or regulations that are not pro-growth? Has the economics profession been captured by interests and by fads and by show me the externality so I can fix it?
I hate to say yes, but it's true. And having made a joke about people over 60 who are bemoaning the young whippersnappers, I am now going to bemoan the young whippersnappers. Academic economics has gone woke. The fraction of papers devoted to inequality, racism, climate change, and so forth has skyrocketed. And in part because, who goes into this is people who want to save the world, and who's the customer is the government. So, this is especially true in like health policy. This is where you can totally see it. Who pays for health policy research? The federal government. Guess what? Health policy research tend to say, oh, here's how to expand the role of the federal government. So it's lonely days for us remaining free marketers. We have to only hope that it's that the fundamental truth of the fact will eventually win out. I see Veronique.
We need Jimmy Carter back.
We might just get him. We might just have him.
We do have Veronique. Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Turn on your camera, Veronique, so we can say hi.
Oh, okay. I don't know if that works, but I'm pretty tech challenged, so I think I have my camera on, but
Yeah.
I don't know. You don't need to see me.
We have a nice picture.
Here's my question.
Everyone can see your nice picture.
Here's my question is, right? I mean, 2 years ago, it was all about, as long as interest rates lower than growth rate, we're gonna be fine. I mean, you've kind of talked about the limits of these papers, the most serious ones like Blanchard and Furman and Summers. It was a time where it was almost unconceivable to most people that we would see in the near term any interest rate increase. It's kind of amazing. It blows my mind. I mean, you and I and many others, Arnold, we've been saying never say never. but it still blows my mind that how, what a difference 2 years can make. And so here's my question. So interest rates are going up. Most of our debt has a maturity of 3 years or less. 30% of our debt, and that's not including coupons, things like this, a maturity of a year. Interest rates going up. When you look at the CBO projection of any small increase in interest rates above the baseline, in terms of budget deficit, it's completely insane. Do you think these interest rates are going to go back down anytime soon? So we go back to a place where, it's like people are like, oh, they'll never go up? Or what happens concretely in terms of the budget, the political economy of so much interest rate payments, but also the role, the impact this will have on inflation based on your work? It's a mouthful of a question. I know, it's a mouthful of a question.
Well, it's not just, you asked the hard questions, which is exactly what I expected of you. I just want to emphasize for everyone else, beware the trend. So interest rates are lower than the growth rate that were for 20 years. Doesn't look like that's forever. I was advised to stop working on inflation because inflation will always and everywhere be 2%. So much for that one. Long-term interest rates are on a downward trend for 40 years. That'll continue forever. The great savings glut or demographics or whatever. Boom. I think Irving Fisher warned us in 1929. He said stocks are on a permanently higher plateau. Well, beware the trend and pay attention to basic economics. It will revive and bite you hard. Right now, interest rates are rising, but real interest rates are still sharply negative. And we are still in the process of inflating away our debt. Basically what I look at is we print up $5 trillion of money with no plan to pay it back. So where's that going to come out of? It's going to inflate away $5 trillion of debt. We're about 3/4 of the way done with that. We've inflated away about 15% of the outstanding debt. We got about 10 to go. But we're still in that period. We are not in a high interest rate period now. We are still in the negative interest rate period. And will we get to positive rates? I think you've asked the huge question that I don't know the answer to. If you view this as a one-time fiscal shock, the price level goes up, we inflate away the debt, and then we're back to where we were. And do we then settle back into whatever forces? Real interest rates were low for decades, and that's not the Fed, that's not monetary policy, that's the marginal product of capital and people wanting to save. Do we settle back into very low real interest rates that are lower and anemically low growth rates, but growth rates that are still bigger than that interest rate and therefore grow out of even larger debts at a slow rate? By the way, it doesn't grow out of large debts if we stop deficits. The R less than G crowd, the interest rates are low crowd, completely forgot that the interest rates are not enough lower than the growth rate to subsidize $1 trillion a deficit every year. We were still on an unsustainable path. Even Blanchard, bless his heart, he said interest rates are less than the growth rate. So you can afford to borrow a lot of money and spend it on whatever you want to spend it, and then go back to zero surpluses. Hello, zero, not $1 trillion a year deficit, zero. So that was already. It was already sort of a fantasy land about a world we don't live in, one where we have, balanced budgets every year. But do we go back to a world of very low interest rates? I don't know, because I don't know, and I don't think anybody knows why we had quite such low interest rates for so long. My thought is that because very slow growth, so it's low marginal product capital and low growth rate is low interest rate. And hopefully we don't go back to that. But you look at history, 1970s had low real interest rates, and then we had 15 years of very high real interest rates, which had something to do with curing inflation. So I don't know, but it's the big question. A lot of people think we're going right back to the zero bound and low interest rates and all that. It may have to look more like 1980s before we get there.
Yeah, I have a feeling that once burned, twice shy for the bond market. I think it'll be a while before people feel confident buying long-term bonds.
Yeah, so where's the outrage? People have lost 15% on their long-term bonds. And the great reserve currency, the great safe asset. Hello, you just paid for the COVID stimulus checks right out of your and they don't seem to care. But
well, they might care going forward. That's the concern. All right.
Yes, no, and that the sanctity of U.S. government debt. That's a really good point. Why are we the reserve asset? Why does everybody love us? Well, because by and large in the past we have paid it off responsibly. And if we're going to get into the business of every crisis, so people say we should have done this. This was like a war. What do you do in a war? You inflate away the outstanding debt because it's a once in a century war, and you go ahead. Well, this wasn't a once. This might be a once every 3 years kind of war. In which case, if you make too much of a habit of inflating away the outstanding debt, people don't lend you at those nice low interest rates anymore. You're kind of like Greece. Greece was able to borrow at low rates because it had pledged itself not to default. Well, once you find out that it's possible to default, they don't lend you at low rates anymore.
Yeah, it's like, you don't want to turn into Argentina. All right, Amy, take next question.
Dennis Sheehan, we have you next.
Hi, I was going to ask, why you thought we overstimulated the economy. Maybe that's too easy a question. So I'm going to ask you, what's the best case you can make if we go back to, say, June 2021? What's the best case you can make for what the Federal Reserve, say, continued to do, or what the federal government continued to do? Can you steelman their argument in a sense?
So I'll give them $1 trillion, but not 5. So once again, financial regulation failed. The untold story of 2020 is that we redid all of the promises we made in 2008 were broken on a grand scale. They started by bailing out the treasury markets. Then they bailed out money market funds. Then the Fed issue a Mario Draghi worthy, it'll do whatever it takes to keep corporate bond prices from failing. Well, if you've let the moral hazard build up, the crisis comes, you got to do some of the bailout. So a wave of business bankruptcies would have been a bad thing. Now, at least in 2008, they had the decency to say, there's a problem here, we'll do something about it. Granted, it was ineffective. Nobody's had the decency to say anything but, oh, yeah, don't worry about it. Every time there's a crisis, we'll just bail everybody out. But, I'll give you $500 billion there. Don't let every restaurant in the country go bankrupt is probably wise. Next, you needed some social insurance. So people who are unemployed or forced, if you're going to lock down the economy, which was a stupid thing to do, but given you're going to lock down the economy, you don't want people dying in the streets. I'll give it, but that doesn't mean that every, government employee who's retired living in Florida on a nice pension needs to have an additional stimulus check. So we just sent money to every registered voter and then some. So I think it was wildly overdone. And it was wildly overdone because, let's get back to Blinder a little bit. Our worthies, our central bank, does not understand there's such a thing as supply. And they thought of the fall in output during the pandemic as lack of demand. Well, people weren't failing to go to restaurants because they didn't have the money to go to restaurants. They were going to restaurants because there's a pandemic on. And by the way, the government had closed the restaurants. And it's like a giant snowstorm. And the minute it goes away, the economy will bounce right back exactly as it did. So they met a supply shock with massive demand, which I think was partially just they don't know about supply. So I think that's my case for it was wildly overdone. And even Larry Summers, Mr. ISLM, who's not out there defending the current administration for whatever its mistakes were, he says it was vastly overdone. Because he looks, he uses, you don't even Mr. Fiscal theory of the price level for this. Just look at classic ISLM. There's an output gap. How big is the plausible size of the output gap? $5 trillion times 1.5. That's a whole lot more than any plausible lack of demand during the pandemic.
Thanks. John Trainer has a question that I know is dear to at least Arnold and my hearts, and probably John's as well. So John, if you'll go ahead and unmute it, you're up.
Okay, thank you. I think my comment might be a little bit along the lines of John Alcorn's in terms of where are we? I'm a card-carrying University of Chicago free market person, speaking from the dark ages as a teacher of advanced placement macroeconomics. And the comment that I wrote is that we've been talking about the pinnacle of analysis, and Yet, about 140,000 students a year take advanced placement macro. More than half of them pass. So that's 70,000 students a year who don't take introductory macro in college. I don't know what they do afterwards. Most of them probably don't take economics, but they learn their macros straight out of the 1970s without much subtlety. It's tough even to get monetarism into that. Well, okay.
Yeah.
I feel a little better getting that off my chest, but it's.
Thank you.
Yeah, yeah, I too have taught AP macro, and I have to tell the students as I start to teach it, I'm going to teach you stuff, but I don't believe any of it because it really does. It's amazing how stable it's been. I mean, it's like the first textbook that I took a macro course out of in 1973. And it's just, it's amazing that the macro wars, A, they didn't affect Blinder, B, they didn't affect policymakers, and C, they haven't affected economics textbooks. I don't think if you took Mankey's textbook, his freshman textbook, you would come away with anything much different than what you would have come away with in 1973. So I don't know. That's just a very interesting cultural phenomenon. I don't know if
You're exactly right, and it does reveal a weakness of contemporary macro in its willingness to take itself seriously and therefore to try to communicate better than it has. There's this joke that science advances one funeral at a time, and to some extent that's true. People hang on to what they learn as undergrads. Now, some of us, like us, I was force-fed the 1976 edition of Dornbush and Fisher, and I thought it was all bullshit, which is why I went into macro. I thought, hey, if here's a field full of bullshit, there's something where somebody of my limited capacity can maybe make some advances. But intertemporal macro is hard. Macro that is, I'll use fancy words, intertemporal general equilibrium. It's based on people who think about today versus tomorrow, it's based on markets that clear. It's not easy to do, and it's not easy to do without inflation. Without equations. And it's so much easier to just push the ISLM curves around. And we do have a crisis, I think a crisis of honesty. I know lots of young macroeconomists. None of them believe it. They're all like this. None of them believe a word of it, but they got to get through the lecture. So they're happy to push the IS and LM curves around and completely without even thinking about what they're doing. And as a blinder, if you allow yourself every 3 years when it fails a patch, you have a nice ex post story you can tell about events. And what's lovely about it is what makes it easy is each year is a separate universe. So it's not connected intertemporally. When I'm thinking about consumption, I just think about this year's income. I don't think about this year's income relative to what's going to happen to me in the future, which makes it hard. When I think about investment, I just think about interest rates. I don't think about whether that investment's going to pay off in the future, and that would be too hard. But so physics doesn't say, well, that relativity stuff, it's too hard. We'll just stick with the easy stuff we can do without equations. So in part, I think there's a great failure in taking it seriously. Now, Bob Barrow tried. He tried to write a real business cycle textbook. I think one could also do it. I've always avoided teaching macro for just this reason. There's so much you could teach. Basic classical growth model. Growth matters way more than anything we're talking about. The basics of Sargent's ends of inflations is all you need to know about inflation. Dynamic public finance, the incentive effects of taxes. You can do a whole lot without pushing the IS and LM curves around. And maybe you should, do what we know rather than the stuff that we actually don't know. But also, I referred to the DSGE, the dynamic stochastic general equilibrium, is the way we do macro. And putting that into words, explaining to policymakers. We don't have black boxes. Meteorologists have black boxes. If you run the National Weather Service's model and it says it's going to rain this weekend, it's going to rain this weekend, and you don't need to really understand the story. Economics are quantitative parables, and you need to understand and explain the story. And modern macro has done a bad job of understanding and explaining the story. There's a chat that asks for where's a reference. The only reference I can give you is Lundquist and Sargent, and it's full of equations, and the equations are hard. And even I notice lots of authors, I read and referee lots of papers, and the equations say one thing and the introduction says something totally different. One of the worst habits of all is equations of a proper rational expectations, market clearing, general equilibrium. And then the introduction says, well, this shows you roughly that aggregate demand pushed and aggregate supply that and the IS and the Lem curve. It has nothing to do with the equations. You're just telling a lie on top of the actual equations in your model. So you are right that there is a failure to summarize, communicate, and an unwillingness to believe what you're doing. I think there's also partly, even some of the people under 60, they got poisoned with this ISLME stuff as undergrads, and then they sort of learned to do proper modeling in order to get published, but they still kind of believe the ISLME stuff, so they're unwilling to write what the equations of their own models say as how we analyze the world. And there's a little bit of hypocrisy in that too.
Thanks so much.